Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute for today's discussion on tackling illicit finance in US art markets. My name's Nate Sibley. I'm a fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I run something called the Kleptocracy Initiative, a program looking at countering transnational crime and corruption emanating from US adversaries like China and Russia and Iran. For those of you joining us for the first time, a special warm welcome. Thank you so many of you to turning out in person, despite the relatively short notice at which we advertised this event. And a special welcome to everyone watching online. I know we often have quite substantially more viewers online than we do in person these days. For those of you joining us for the first time, Hudson's a non-partisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., focused on foreign policy, national security, and promoting US global leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. How does that fit in with the art world? It's not something that comes up a lot here at Hudson Institute. We're much more used to having events about, building up the size of the US naval fleet or renewing our nuclear programs and that sort of thing. And art itself isn't something that you immediately think of when you think of sort of money laundering and sanctions evasion and that side of things, let alone those national security issues. But for some time now, it has been a very attractive vehicle for money launderers and sanctions evaders, for reasons that we're going to discuss in more detail today. It's particularly important for the US because the US has the world's largest, by far, I think most dynamic art market, which is great, but it also means that it's sort of become a magnet for dirty money because there are a number of vulnerabilities and loopholes surrounding, the various issues we'll get into today that can cause problems. And it's important for the US because in addition to sort of the amount of money that circulates through US art markets, as the global leader in this, the US also has the power somewhat to set global norms and standards. So we'll also be looking at kind of solutions today. And there are cases, unfortunately, recently where money launderers for the cartels, sort of terrorist financiers, foreign kleptocrats have all been caught, and there are solid examples of them of exploiting these vulnerabilities. And as always, with these transnational crime and corruption issues, when we see the cases that are reported, we're really only probably seeing the tip of the iceberg. And that said, we're probably not talking about the kind of huge sums that we usually talk about when we do Kleptocracy Initiative events, relative to sort of other more familiar money laundering methodologies. But it's not insignificant either. And all this money that every dollar that's laundered through the art market, it incentivizes or facilitates activities that more directly threaten the safety and security of Americans. And that's why we're talking about it here today at Hudson Institute. So joining me to paint a fuller picture, if you will, I was very proud of the pun I did for the title of the event, so I'm going to try and keep that going today. To my left is Tess Davis. She's a lawyer and archaeologist by training, and she's currently the executive director of the Antiquities Coalition, which is a global sort of campaign against cultural racketeering. So if Lara Croft or Thomas Crown sees you guys in a dark alley, they need to sort of run the other direction because that's precisely what you guys don't like. Joining us virtually, and I'm seeing for the first time on the screen there, is Tim Carpenter, who is the managing director and CEO of Argus Cultural Property Consultants. Before that, he's the former head of the FBI's art crime team. So for nearly 3 decades, he led investigations into exactly the kind of money laundering schemes we'll be talking about today, including working on the biggest ever recovery of looted cultural property by the US government, which was very impressive. So thank you so much for joining us from so far away today, Tim.
Happy to.
And last but not least is Scott Graytack, who I've worked with for many years now, a lawyer, and he's now the Deputy Director of Transparency International US. I think most people tuning in today will recognize Transparency International as the world's biggest, sort of most powerful, most persuasive advocacy group on these transnational crime and corruption issues. He's also on the advisory board, as am I, of the Vandenberg Coalition, which is a sort of national security network which looks at these issues through the foreign policy and national security lens. So I think we have a good range of perspectives represented here today. And I'm just going to start by asking each of you to talk about this issue from the perspective of which you've been working on it. And maybe, Tess, you could kick us off. Why does the Antiquities Coalition think money laundering in the art markets is so important to your mission?
Fantastic, and thank you for the introduction, and also thank you to Hudson for hosting today. And
It is an honor to be with such a distinguished panel from such impressive organizations. Again, I'm Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition. We are a nonprofit and think tank based here in Washington, dedicated to ensuring that criminals do not exploit the $70 billion global art market. And in this mission, we join forces with the US government across a number of agencies, including the Bureau, but also Homeland Security Investigations, Department of Justice, the State Department. This really cuts across a lot of different aspects of the US government. We work with foreign governments around the world in every region but Antarctica, and with intergovernmental organizations, including the ones you would guess, like UNESCO, but also ones that might not initially come to mind, like the G20 and NATO. So thankfully, in recent years, there's been a growing awareness that art and antiquities, that looting and trafficking is funding organized crime, funding terrorism. I'm sure everyone remembers when the shots of ISIS, destroying sites, made the news, and of course the news that came out afterwards about the profits they were making from this industry. But in recent years, we've also had a number of smoking guns showing that these crimes are going far beyond war zones and really exploiting economic integrity and the global market. So art is vulnerable to this for a number of reasons. First, just the dollar amounts. Again, the art market, we're talking about a $70 billion global art market. And as you correctly mentioned, the United States is by far the largest share of that. We're about half, pretty consistently. But there are other factors that really make it high risk. One, for art, you don't have VIN numbers or serial numbers like you have on cars or even guns. There's no registries, there's no land title registry. And also, art is it's unique in many ways compared to other goods of comparable value. You can roll up a painting and bring it through customs, probably unnoticed. You can ship things quite easily through FedEx and DHL, probably unnoticed. It's different than a lot of the other goods that we see that are vulnerable to these things. And another factor that's made it high risk is that the art market has traditionally had this culture of what you could call discretion or you could call secrecy. It's not unusual at all to spend millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars on an artwork and not know who's selling it to you. That's exactly what happens at an auction house. You're trusting the auction house to do the vetting for you. As we'll be discussing today, sometimes they do, and sometimes, there's gaps to this. But think of what other world can you spend $100 million on something and not know who's selling it to you. You would hope that all these factors would have made art more regulated, but instead the opposite has happened because we think, at least, because this is often viewed as a victimless crime. And so I hope if there's one takeaway today, it's that it's not a victimless crime, that there's really harm that is happening to national security, global security, economic integrity, and regular people, communities, and countries around the world. You've mentioned, there's been some cases documenting this. People have been warning about this forever, but we now have a growing body of evidence thanks to the work that the Bureau has done, thanks to the work HSI has done and the Department of Justice has done, as well as state-level prosecutors like the Manhattan DA's office. And there's some really damning examples. I don't know, has everyone seen the picture of Putin play in his judo uniform, along with the horseback riding and the other photos? So the gentleman in the judo photos with him are his childhood friends, the Rodenberg brothers. They're huge oligarchs. One built the bridge to Crimea that is such a target and in the news so often, and the other did the infrastructure for the Sochi Olympics. So we're talking big, big money. Several years ago, the US government was very concerned that sanctions imposed on Russia following the illegal annexation of Crimea, so we're talking before the wider investigation, weren't working. And so they tasked the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations into finding out why. Now, it's important to note this mandate had nothing to do with the art market. It wasn't on their radar at all. They were just like, how do the Rodenbergs and others keep living this lavish lifestyle, even though we have thrown everything at them? And the investigators quickly realized it was gaps in the art market. They found the Rodenbergs had laundered at least $18 million, and they say multiple times in the report, this is, as you mentioned, the tip of the iceberg. because of these gaps, because of the lack of regulation, because of the lack of AML rules. Another case, Nazim Ahmad, financier for Hezbollah. Some law enforcement have described him to us as the leading financier for Hezbollah. Recent indictment laying out a host of felonies against him, documenting $160 million of transactions through the US financial system using art and diamonds. So big, growing sums of money. As you mentioned, just the tip of the iceberg. These cases we find out about them randomly. So it makes you wonder what else is out there. And a real reason to care about this beyond the harm of what's happening to the cultural objects, the cultural sites themselves.
That's fantastic as an introductory overview, and I think explains more clearly than I was able to why we're looking at these issues at a national security think tank this morning rather than a talk at an art gallery, because it goes far beyond what is, on the surface of it, nothing to do with, as you say, but behind those big sales, there are illicit financial flows that come from drug dealers, terrorists, so people who really do affect the safety and security of people on the street. Someone who spent his life working to investigate these schemes is Tim Carpenter, as I mentioned. Tim, I wondered if you could talk a bit for a few minutes about some of the challenges, opportunities, obstacles to the investigations you've undertaken, both with the Bureau and, of course, in your new role in the private sector.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nate, and good to see everybody there. Sorry I couldn't join you in person, but thanks for having me on today. I think it's important. Let me get the legal thing out of the way first, so just to make sure everybody understands. I'm retired from the FBI, so I don't officially represent any opinions or positions of the FBI. So just let me do that piece right out of the gate. But I can talk to you kind of, the 1,000-foot view level, if you will, about historical efforts that the Bureau has aimed at, preventing and uncovering money laundering within the art market. Look, guys, this is nothing new, right? This has been going on for decades. And if you've seen me talk or lecture about money laundering in the art market before, you've probably heard me say, kind of tongue in cheek, but smart criminals launder their money with art. It does remain, as Tess has kind of intimated here, it does remain largely the Wild West. It's one of the last unregulated commodities market, particularly in the United States, but globally. We're seeing some strengthening on that, particularly in Europe and some other areas, but we still have a lot of work to do on that front, and we have a lot of work to do here domestically at the homeland. You asked about some of the challenges. So I've been talking about money laundering for a long time. We've been talking to the media, we've talked to Congress, we've done a lot of these types of seminars and lectures. And one of the criticisms that we get, or one of the from the opposition, right? If you talk to a lot of folks in the art market, particularly on the commercial side, they'll try to convince you that there really isn't any money laundering going on in the art market. And to bolster that argument, they'll point to a lack of convictions, a lack of cases. And they'll say, well, because, the Department of Justice and the FBI don't have 100 convictions related to money laundering in art, therefore it must not be happening. And that's a really important point for me to make, that it's utter nonsense, really. We do know that money laundering takes place daily across the art market because it is largely unregulated, and it's an easy market for them to move wealth in. We could spend all day probably talking about the various schemes, whether we're talking about traditional money laundering cases versus trade-based money laundering. But it is an area of significant concern for us. And in fact, in 2017, as I was running the FBI's art crime program, we made money laundering the #1 priority for the program. Money laundering and sanctions evasion, just to acknowledge the significant threat that it's created for us.
Well, thank you so much. That was a really good introduction to that as well. I'll definitely have a few more questions for you in a minute, Tim. So please don't go anywhere. Scott, though, you do a lot of work, as does TI, on the broader US anti-money laundering system. The foundational legislation, which is the Bank Secrecy Act. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, just your reflections on the role of money laundering in art, but also how this might fit into that broader framework.
So we've seen some of the largest corruption scandals in modern history have involved corrupt leaders from different parts of the world using the art market as a way of moving, hiding, and growing the money that they steal from their own citizens. If you are a foreign corrupt leader, you can't just take money out of your national treasury. You can't just accept bribes in order to turn a blind eye or to give someone a favor and hide that money under your mattress. You've got to keep it safe in case the people of your country find out. They may come after you. They may be able to seize that money. And so very often is the case, they choose to move that money into the United States. Once upon a time, think of Pablo Escobar as kind of my go-to example. He used to just show up at a US bank with a bag of money. They wouldn't ask questions about where it came from. They'd take the money. He'd be able to use our financial system that way. As we've closed off those avenues through things like the Bank Secrecy Act, they require every bank in the country to have anti-money laundering laws. You have to know who's putting that money in the system. You have to do risk assessments. You have to flag suspicious transactions, keep records. So they go to other places. And that money has moved to areas like real estate, private equity, and the art market. And so whether you are a terrorist financier, a sanctioned oligarch, or a corrupt official, you are more and more likely finding those loopholes, finding those gaps, and moving your money there. So let me give you a couple examples what this looks like in the real world. One of the biggest corruption scandals in the world in the past 20 years came out of Equatorial Guinea. This is one of the highest oil-rich countries in the world, and yet also has extreme inequality. A lot of folks there don't have access to safe drinking water. Their hospitals aren't resourced with antibiotics. The electricity goes off intermittently, and at the same time, the son of the president there, who was the vice president, was able to move and hide hundreds of millions of stolen dollars from his people in the United States, including by investing in art and using intermediaries, so the dealers who find that art and buy it for him. He used anonymous companies so that the folks who were doing those transactions didn't have to know that it actually involved him. And so they weren't able to even flag that this was the ultimate owner of the art. Another very high-profile example out of Malaysia. This is a corruption scandal in the last decade that toppled their government. Their prime minister is in prison now for corruption charges. They were involved in a network where they stole $4.5 billion from the people of Malaysia. This is money that should have gone toward infrastructure and building schools and roads, especially in rural parts of the country. Instead, took that money, funneled it to buy Monets, Rothkos, some really premier, very prominent art. This is where these corrupt officials are choosing to move and hide their dollars. They know that other avenues of taking this dirty money have been closed off, especially in the United States. Art is still a very much open avenue.
That's amazing. Thank you, Scott. Tim, I wanted to come back to you first. You mentioned that you could go on all day about some of the different schemes you've encountered, from sort of fairly conventional money laundering schemes to sort of more complicated trade-based money laundering. Could you maybe just spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the main, just very practically walk us through how you launder money through art, some of the typical schemes you've come across, not the kind of more elaborate ones who are very, very clever, but how is this done on a day-to-day basis? Just so in case the audience kind of doesn't realize, I'm a criminal, I have a nice painting, or I have a bag of cash, I walk into an art dealer. What is going on?
Yeah, great question. Kind of a difficult one to answer. I think let's start with framing the two types of money laundering we're talking about, right? Traditional money laundering and trade-based money laundering. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some distinct differences, right? If we think about traditional money laundering schemes, right, that's where we think about, I want to clean illicit proceeds, right? So I've engaged in some type of criminal activity. Maybe I'm a drug cartel, and I've got, let's say, $1 million in dirty drug money. So a traditional money laundering scheme is to move those illicit proceeds into a legitimate financial market sector. So whether into the banking industry, through real estate, casinos, any of these types of financial markets, they want to move that money into. And there's a really defined process for doing that, right? It typically starts with structuring small structured amounts of funds that go into the system, and then moving that through layering and some other techniques. We see some of that, right, in the art market where, some of these cases that we're talking about, like the 1MDB case and some of these others, where they were engaged in traditional criminal schemes through embezzlement, fraud, theft, any of these types of traditional criminal schemes, and then they needed to move those financial resources into legitimate markets. And so that's kind of where we see on one end, they'll take some of those illicit proceeds and use them to purchase artwork sometimes as a store of value, right? So they want to hold on to that artwork. Maybe they've bought a 10 or $50 million piece. They can maintain that piece for a number of years. They can move it easily across borders. And then realize, the gain or the proceeds from those illicit funds and clean them. Trade-based money laundering is a little bit different, where we talk about, cleaning those funds or moving those illicit proceeds into the market streams through commodities, right? Through trade. And so that's where we always saw kind of the real risk in the art market, where we did see some cases of traditional money laundering. Really, the threat for us was related to trade-based money laundering. And so at its core, right, the most simple example of something like that would be you're a criminal organization and you're based in Europe. You want to move, again, let's go with $1 million. You want to move $1 million into the US market stream. Well, it's very difficult to move $1 million in cash across the border. But as Tess has pointed out, art, cultural property can move across the borders quite easily, right? It can be small. It has a lot of value. Border agents, law enforcement generally aren't experts, right? So they don't necessarily know what they're looking at that comes across the border. They wouldn't know perhaps a $1,000 painting versus $1 million painting. And so these criminal organizations rely on that to move those pieces into the market stream. So if, again, back to my example, if you've got $1 million in cash, illicit cash, you can purchase a painting, whether through an auction or a dealer. You can then move that painting easily across the borders, realize the profits from that painting by reselling it at auction, maybe in New York or in LA. And you've then effectively cleaned your money because you now have a legitimate receipted transaction that's really not questioned by anybody in the industry, and is going to be difficult for law enforcement to identify. So that's a really basic kind of a trade-based money laundering scheme.
That's fantastic, thank you. It can be sort of difficult when we launch straight into these big themes to just actually go through how this works in practice if you're a criminal on the ground. So I'm hearing there's a number of attributes to art that make it particularly attractive as a vehicle for money laundering. I'm hearing there's a lack of regulation around the art market that makes it relatively easy to exploit compared to, for example, a bank, which has long had much more regulatory scrutiny placed on it in this area. Before we move on to solutions, though, I want to get a sense of whether there are trends that we can identify which may tell us whether this problem is getting broadly better or worse. Is money laundering through art a problem that's going to only grow in coming years, or are there signs sort of, before we get on to sort of necessarily regular, I think we'll probably talk about some legislation that's pending later on, but do you think this problem is getting better or worse? I guess, Tess, maybe start with you.
All right, well, just to build on what Scott was saying, especially after 9/11 with the legislation that followed, with the advances in law enforcement that followed, it's getting harder and harder and harder for criminals and armed insurgents and terrorists, to hide and launder money. Like the avenues are being cut off one by one. And art, as Tim said, really remains the wild, wild west. I mean, just about every sector, actually every sector of comparable risk and scale is already subject to our horribly named law, the Bank Secrecy Act. Even a pawn shop, and I'm from Macon, Georgia. A pawn shop in Macon, Georgia has to follow these laws, but an auction house like Sotheby's or Christie's that have exactly the same business model, but with a lot more zeros on the end, don't. It just doesn't make sense. And something we want to stress too is that this isn't just harming national security. It's not just harming economic integrity. It's harming the legitimate market as well. Because what you have now is that leaders, in the art market have realized this is a problem. Their own the art market's leading ethical guidelines all warn that this is high risk, that they need to be on the lookout for this. And the most legitimate dealers, have taken steps. They have set up compliance programs. They have done all of these things. And they're at a business disadvantage until we require everyone to do it, till we level the playing field. Because now, an oligarch or Nazim Ahmad, the terrorist financer, or a drug cartel leader just has to go to their competitor. So we think this will also protect the legitimate market, and the vast majority of the market is legitimate. If you look at these cases, by and large, it's not responsible art market leaders doing these things. It's criminals who are looking at these gaps and taking advantage of them, and the art market failing to protect itself.
Yeah, Scott, do you have any thoughts on?
And I mean, the experience so one of the benefits of being able to work in an international network on these issues, you see how the United States would not be the first country by a mile to do this. So the EU adopted something called the 5th and then the 6th anti-money laundering directives over the past few years. The UK has adopted reforms that cover this. Even Switzerland has addressed integrity in the art market. Initially, in a lot of those countries, industries were hesitant or resistant, and then ultimately they are proud of the fact that they have been professionalized through this, that there's greater integrity to the work that they do. And in places like Switzerland, they even now wear it as a badge of honor. And they say, you know, because of how strict our rules are and how clean our markets are, you know that you can bring your products through our market, and it gives them a competitive advantage. So the United States is, as Tessa's saying, the largest art market. We are the largest gap when it comes to illicit finance through the art market. Yes, this is something that just recently, in the past 5-10 years, has been taken up in the UK, in the EU, places like Switzerland, France, but the trajectory is pretty clear. I mean, Canada's looking at this as well. They've had, you know, government consultations around this issue. They're thinking about going the direction of the EU. I think we have the opportunity and the obligation and certainly the need to be able to follow suit and see that this is not going to be changing the art industry writ large. This is not going to be putting out of business, you know, smaller art dealers. And we can talk about the legislation that's been drafted that addresses the specific needs and circumstances of smaller dealers.
I'd like to move on to that. Before we do, it just occurs to me, you know, we do, taking my moderator's hat off for maybe a minute or two, something we do a lot of work on here at Hudson Institute is combating the deadly fentanyl trade and the associated sort of criminality and hostile state actors that operate around that. And one of the things that fentanyl has brought is the involvement of Chinese money laundering organizations, Chinese sort of triads and transnational criminal organizations into the drug money laundering kind of orbit in the US. They have some very unique attributes and capabilities that makes them much more dangerous than, you know, their Colombian or Lebanese sort of forebears who used to launder money for the cartels. One of which is that they have access to China's domestic demand for offshore dollars. As a kind of, they have a triangle of transactions rather than just one or two ways. I could really use a graph to sort of explain this, but I'll do my best. When you know, the cartels sell drugs here in the US, they will take the cash to one of these Chinese money laundering organizations, operatives. They will then perform sort of a three-way transaction, typically. They will send an equivalent amount of money to the cartels in Mexico or wherever they are in their local currency. They're paid. But they don't charge commission on that. And that's why it's so lucrative for the cartels to be engaged in this partnership with the Chinese criminal organizations. Where the Chinese criminal organizations make their money is tapping into wealthy Chinese families' desire to get their money out of China. They're trying to get their money out of China because it's an increasingly repressive place to be a wealthy, successful person, given Xi Jinping's crackdown on ostentatious displays of wealth. They have capital controls. No Chinese individual is allowed to transfer more than $50,000 out of the country at a time per year. But obviously they want to get the money out of China because it's safer to have it in somewhere like the United States where there's rule of law. And so what they do is they send money to the Chinese money organizations who will then transfer within the US then the equivalent dollar amount. So there's a sort of three-way swap going between the cartels, wealthy Chinese families, and the Chinese money laundering organizations. I need a shorter way of saying that in the middle. This has, if you talk to people at the FBI or anywhere, this system in recent years has really transformed and boosted the profit incentives driving the drug trade, the profits available to those involved in it, and the difficulty with which, the difficulties of tracing it for law enforcement. And it strikes me that, as a long roundabout way of saying this is, when the Chinese money organizations transfer their dollars to wealthy Chinese families who are trying to get their money out, they're not handing over bags of cash. They do it, they'll transfer the deeds to, they'll either do just a straightforward bank transfer, but that carries its own risks given the regulatory scrutiny that they're under. But it also, so they'll typically use real estate or high value assets. And art seems to me, I don't know of any cases, so they reported cases. But again, it's what you don't, if I can think of it, then they've certainly thought of it, put it that way. And so that strikes me as that might well be something that's making the problem worse here in the US. Again, without evidence, I'm putting that out there, but it's something to keep an eye on, I think.
Well, no, and not only that, I mean, I mentioned the US is the largest art market in the world, but China is rapidly catching up. Mm-hmm. It's 2 or 3 depending on the year, with the UK, the US, and China are consistently the top 3. So hundreds of millions, billions of dollars are going. And again, this is what we're seeing, what's being reported in the statistics.
Yep. So there's plenty of reasons that this problem is probably getting worse, specifically here in the US. As other countries actually crack down, we become a more attractive jurisdiction for money launderers and sanctions evaders. So I think we're getting towards the last sort of third of the event now, so it really would be a good time to crack on and talk about some of the solutions that have been proposed. Again, Tess, maybe because I know Antiquities Coalition has done so much work on this with Congress. There is legislation that's been introduced, bipartisan legislation that would address this problem. Could you sort of talk a bit about what it is and what it would do?
Yes, no, fantastically. And again, mentioning the Bank Secrecy Act has come up a lot, and this is the 50-year-old law that sought to protect the United States financial system from money laundering and other financial crimes that art has long escaped. But we're very grateful to a bipartisan team of Senators Fetterman and Grassley who have really been championing this issue with the Art Market Integrity Act. And basically what this will do is we'll extend the same protections to the art market that have long existed for, again, every industry of comparable risk and scale. As Scott mentioned, this law very closely seeks to mirror the protections that are already in place in both the UK and Europe, including Switzerland. Mm-hmm. So the art market being a global industry, a lot of players are having to comply with these rules already. So it really sought to narrowly tailor the legislation to the problem, common sense rules and protections that align with what are increasingly global standards. And again, we're hopeful. It has strong support, 6 senators now, 3 from each party. There's wide recognition that this is a bipartisan issue that everyone can get behind. And again, if it doesn't happen, I think we really do risk the U.S. becoming the safe haven as these other states around the world are cracking down on this. We're going to be the gap. And it's unfortunate because our law enforcement is really leading the world in terms of investigations, both at the Bureau and at HSI, but we need to give them the tools to do that. And so this bill does have strong support from the law enforcement community, the National Border Patrol Council, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, and others, and I think that's a reflection of that.
That's great. And sorry, I should have done my own legal bit. We don't endorse legislation here at Hudson. I just think it's interesting that this has popped up now, and I think it's important to talk about what the policy effects of such legislation could be. Scott, could you just walk us through very quickly what the requirements are under the Bank Secrecy Act? So if art galleries and art dealers were suddenly brought under this, if this legislation passed tomorrow, what would they suddenly wake up and find themselves having to do that they're not doing already?
So importantly, the suite of AML requirements is very customizable. It really depends on whether you're a bank or a casino, a jeweler, a travel agency. You can have different requirements for those different sectors of the financial those parts of the economy in the United States, and the legislation reflects that. So it says, for example, if you were doing this typically, a regulated dealer would have to have an anti-money laundering program. They would have to sort of have a written plan for how they address money laundering risks. They would have to have a designated person in their organization that is responsible for that. They would have to collect information if you are a company and you come in and you say, hey, I want to use your services to purchase art. You would have to figure out who is the actual human being behind that company or human beings who own it or control it. That's called the beneficial owner. You would have to basically do a risk assessment, what they call customer due diligence or know your customer. in the industry, to make sure that this isn't somebody who's under indictment for corruption in a foreign country, or it's not coming from a jurisdiction that is a high risk for corruption or other criminality. You would have to keep records about the transactions that you do on behalf of your client, and then you would have to flag suspicious transactions to the federal government through what's called a suspicious activity report. But again, and this is in the legislation itself, those are customizable and they're risk-based. So it could be that as the US Treasury looks at the art market and sees typologies for how illicit funds are moved through the industry, that they apply certain requirements to certain types of dealers. And there is room in the legislation for exemptions. They want to make this something that fits. What I think is really smart about the legislation is that it mirrors exactly the thresholds that are used in the EU and in the UK. So basically, if you don't have a single transaction that is $10,000 or more, so if you don't buy art for a client that's valued at $10,000 or more, this is totally irrelevant to you. This wouldn't touch you. And if you, in the aggregate, over the course of a year, are selling or involved in less than 50,000, this also doesn't apply to you. So we're talking about inherently higher risk players in this market, and the corresponding anti-money laundering requirements that will apply to them is flexible to meet that risk. And I think that's the strongest part about this piece of legislation. I think it's why you've seen such good bipartisan support, is it's flexible to meet industry needs, but also be tailored toward those risks.
And I'm really glad to hear that, because as you were listing off the requirements of what someone would have to do, I was thinking about the owner of a little gallery on a boardwalk, someone that sells shell art that their auntie makes or something like that.
And I should say
they're just not going to have to worry about that.
And artists themselves.
Talking about the big galleries in Miami, where they've got.
If you're making your own art, you are explicitly exempt from these things.
So no Etsy.
Correct.
They do like knitted, sock puppets and things on Etsy. They don't have to worry about this. Okay,
that's right.
Well, that's very good to know. It's good to hear that it's being targeted specifically. I'm interested in about how that information. You mentioned they have to file suspicious activity reports, to the Treasury if they encounter suspicious clients or transactions. Tim, I wonder, with your experience in the FBI, would access to that kind of information have been helpful to you? I presume so, during the course of your investigations. If art galleries were flagging when suspicious activity was taking place, would that provide a lead for you? Would it be something you would tap into in the course of an ongoing investigation? How would you use this information, basically?
Yeah, great question, and for sure, 100% it's useful. In fact, I would say the vast majority of our money laundering cases, emanated from suspicious activity reports or some type of reporting from FinCEN or some of the financial institutions directly. So yeah, they're very critical.
Those are reports that were filed by banks, and you sort of saw that there was a link to your case in art crime there, right? So because obviously the art galleries themselves aren't filing them yet because they're not under the regulation. So these were suspicious activity reports filed by banks or some other group that is regulated, and you were able to sort of extrapolate clues for your case, basically.
For sure, right? I mean, you think about it, these types of investigations are extraordinarily resource intensive, and that's one of the limiting factors for us. And again, I kind of talked about this at the beginning, and you yourself, Nate, mentioned about a lack of cases. People often point to that, a lack of cases, a lack of successful prosecutions or indictments or convictions on these cases as evidence that it doesn't exist. But that's not really the case, right? It's just a really complex environment that we have to operate in, and they're very resource intensive. They're difficult investigations to do, and we just simply don't have the resources to delve deep into those financial transactions. And so we rely on these institutions, whether it's FinCEN, the financial institutions themselves, or the dealers and the auction houses, to come forward with us to tell us, hey, we have this suspicious transaction, and then we can start dedicating resources.
That's great, thank you. Scott, just one final question. And I think our last 5 minutes or so, I'll open up to see if anyone has any comments or questions. The Trump administration, since it came in, I think the Biden administration before was very keen on this kind of, they were very interested in transnational corruption. It was a big priority for them. And so they were very open to extending anti-money laundering regulations and tried to move a number of initiatives forward on that point. The Trump administration has placed a greater priority on deregulation, which carries its own national security benefits, because if it boosts the economy, there's less burdens on businesses, the US is wealthier, we're better able to fund our own defense and so on. So there's arguments both ways, right? But given the deregulatory focus, I think a number of these sort of things, like they were going to include investment banks, you mentioned, I think earlier, like private equity.
Advisors, yeah.
They would also be brought under these types of regulations soon under legislation that has been passed, right, by Congress. But that's sort of been delayed while they're looking at it, if there's a way they can make it more streamlined or whatever. Which begs the question, if this legislation were passed tomorrow, is it much use sort of having it if the Trump administration decides, this is just too much of a burden, we're going to sort of implement this in a very minimal, narrow way?
So the Trump administration, so in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot of really good advancements when it comes down to cracking down on illicit finance. You mentioned private equity, so whether investment advisors have to have anti-money laundering obligations, the residential real estate market in the United States, whether or not those participants have to have anti-money laundering requirements. Those rules are still moving forward. Yes, they've been delayed, but these are still things that are priorities and on the agenda for Treasury and FinCEN. Yep. I think what we've seen writ large, whether this is on the Hill or in the administration, there's still a really strong commitment to fighting illicit finance. I mean, the Treasury Department put out a study in the last few months looking at how fentanyl trafficking and other drug trafficking networks, the kind of typologies they are using to launder their money. There are interests in how China, you mentioned, is able to move its ill-gotten gains around the world, or how Russian oligarchs are evading sanctions. There are a lot of on-ramps for national security experts and illicit finance experts in the Trump Treasury Department. We think this hits squarely with it as well. So we don't think there's any reason to think there's going to be a lot of daylight between say the Biden administration and Trump's second term. And I think that's reflected in the interest we've seen on the bill on the Hill. I mean, it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats.
That's right.
They align on it. Yeah.
No, it's great. And so much of this legislation has been bipartisan, as you say. I've sort of been aware of it and worked with you on issues adjacent to it myself. So, and it's great to see Senator Fetterman's staff here today. We know he took a fall recently, so we wish him well and a happy and swift recovery. And thank him for his leadership on this legislation, which sounds like a really interesting opportunity. But with that, I'd like to sort of just open it up quickly. If anyone's got any sort of quick comments or questions for our speakers, just raise your hand. And please do, if you're going to, please do state your name and your affiliation. Anyone? Any takers? No, wow. Well, I think, oh, there we go. Go on. I'll bring back the auction house analogy. There we go. Sorry, that's a weak one.
I like Julia Rota. How would you address the media narrative of exciting art theft crimes and the glory high octane excitement of that, when in reality there is a lot of damage and harm done, not just to the patrimony, the recent Paris theft, now and even years ago the Gardner one, which is still not resolved, but there is actual harm done, not just in cash but also in patrimony.
Yeah, Tessie, would you want to?
Yes, I would, and I will say that again, as a trained archaeologist, I think like most, there is a fedora and whip lurking in the house for Halloween at some point. Love the Indiana Jones films, love the Thomas Crown Affair, and actually, the end of the Thomas Crown Affair, I think, is very relevant, where the cop is deciding whether to pursue Thomas Crown for stealing this painting from the Met Museum, if you haven't seen it. And he's like, lady, I got real criminals to go after. Some rich guy wants to steal a painting. I've got more important things to do. And I think, unfortunately, that message, has carried the day. But again, if the audience can take away one thing from today, that's not the reality of what we're seeing. Our art, and actually the Indiana Jones, I think, movies are a bit accurate in this regard, that you have the Nazi state prioritizing stealing these pieces. We're seeing this in Putin's Russia right now. Putin's had a strategy for cultural plunder, theft, and exploitation dating back to the 90s, because they recognize the value of it politically, economically, and in terms of conflict. And so this is causing real harm. I mean, dating back to the Nazis, largest theft in history, largest property theft in history. Gardner crime, largest, still I believe to this day, single property theft in history. But this isn't funding, just that. It's funded the Khmer Rouge. It's funded ISIS. It's funded, Hezbollah, as we've discussed, the Taliban, the cartels. These are very bad guys who are profiting from this. So correcting that false narrative is a big challenge of our organization. And again, the work that law enforcement has been doing to blow the lid off of these cases has really helped in recent years.
Yeah, we need to move away from the sort of lovable gentleman rogue type thing. That belongs in a museum is our byword. Yeah, I think you had a question as well, sir.
Hello, my name is Will Ford. I'm an intern at the Hudson Institute, and I really appreciate your guys' discussion about art theft and how it can be a real vehicle for sanctions evasion, which is really, really important, especially as the U.S. as national security and economics become more and more intertwined. But I'm really curious if you guys have any thoughts. You guys have talked about how enforcement for art laundering is very different across different countries and even among NATO allies, like between the U.S. and the EU, for instance. Do you guys think that it's important, in addition to just having similar standards to the EU, to also have a lot of cross-collaboration on issues of art laundering? And have there been any interesting cases of collaboration between governments? And how has the Trump administration's stance towards the EU, everything been affecting that?
Actually, I'm going to direct that to Tim, if that's all right. Would you mind, from your time in government, how extensive was international cooperation on these issues, or did you find that the US was really leading alone on enforcement?
Well, no, I don't think we were leading alone, that's for sure. I mean, we enjoyed strong relationships with quite a few of our European partners, some of our Asian partners, even some in South America. The FBI and Homeland Security are not the only agencies globally that are dedicated to combating cultural property crime. Right? We look to our Italian friends at the Carabinieri, the Brits, the Germans, the French. They all have really strong, dedicated teams. Not all quite as large as ours, but this was a transnational problem, continues to be a transnational problem. It is going to take cooperation amongst all those agencies in order to combat and solve it, just like with any other traditional criminal scheme that we're working. I personally think we're probably a decade behind in the United States. We have some work to do to catch up with some of our European partners that are focused a bit more of a laser focus on this issue. But I think with the bill that's floating around, and I think the winds are shifting in a positive direction. We're going to continue to see strengthening of those relationships.
That's great. Thanks. Tess, your organization still works internationally on this stuff. Is that your sense as well, that the wind is shifting and other countries are sort of helping shape the narrative here?
And also just to build, actually, it's funny you mentioned NATO. My colleague and I just returned from actually participating in 2 different NATO training sessions, one of which was actually supported by funded by the U.S. government, and another that we organized. So there is growing concern within the alliance that this is a threat to the alliance because of these before mentioned reasons. But as Tim mentioned, this is a winning issue for us as the United States, both in terms of the investigations into looting and trafficking, and again, as your example with Switzerland, ensuring that we have a trustworthy, responsible art market. The work that U.S. federal law enforcement have done, that the Manhattan DA's office have done in partnership with the Carabinieri, with the French, with Cambodians, Indians, fill in the blank country. This is, it's front page news in these countries when we're successfully doing these cases. And so, it's a diplomatic issue as well, which is why we've been glad to see, past, the last several administrations, including this one, a continued focus on it.
Yeah. No, I hadn't thought of that, but there's a strong, in a way that, with maybe the more faceless money laundering methodologies, sometimes these artworks are very, and antiquities, they're very close to the national soul, You can hear I'm originally from the UK. We have an ongoing, sort of discourse, dialogue with Greece over the Parthenon marbles, which is always in the front pages of the news whenever these things flare up. But anyway, so I think I've learned so much today. We went really around this issue from every angle. Is there any last sort of burning comments? I usually make people do comments at the end, but actually you were also comprehensive. It's only really if something.
I'll just say in this moment, going after illicit finance in the art market. We mentioned the great bipartisan support for it, but this is seen not only by our allies, we mentioned the EU, the UK, but also within our own Democrat, Republican administrations. The Treasury Department, just to mention this, had a report a few years ago where they basically said all the things the United States government could be doing to crack down on dirty money, proceeds of corruption. It's the real estate market, it's private equity, and the art market is up there. We've got those first two rulemakings. Yes, they are delayed, but they're still going forward. A lot of that work has been done. This is what needs to be done next, through the Treasury's own way of pinpointing what's needed. So the fact that in this moment we've had this bill that has been out for only about 4 months, already has great bipartisan support. This is what the United States needs to do to meet the moment and align with our allies, get best practices, and protect, again, the largest section of this market in the entire world. I think there's a real urgency to getting that done.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds like a good point on which to end. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Tess. And thank you, Tim, for joining us. Thank you all for joining us here at Hudson and online. A bit of a different issue than our audiences are used to sort of hearing about, as I mentioned at the start. We're used more often involved in looking at the sort of hard power policy issues. But I think we've heard today that there are hard power implications to this. And it sounds like there is a plan to deal with it. So I wish you all sort of the best of luck with that. And thank you all again for coming. And we'll see you next time.